They called him a rebel. The world called him defeated. But to millions of Igbo people, he was the lion who refused to kneel. January 11th, 1970. Uli, Airstrip, Biafra. Chukwuemeka Odumegu Ojukwu stood in the darkness, listening to the roar of engines and the distant thunder of artillery. Behind him, 3 years of war, 1 million dead, cities reduced to ash. Ahead, a super constellation aircraft, the last plane out, and exile. This man, born into unimaginable wealth, educated at Oxford, destined for a life of comfort, had chosen the opposite of safety. He had risked everything for a nation the world refused to recognize. This is his story, from millionaire son to revolutionary, from Oxford graduate to the face of Biafran resistance, from exile to elder statesman. The rise, the war, the fall, and the return no one expected. November 4th, 1933, Zunguru, northern Nigeria. Chukwuemeka Odumegu Ojukwu entered the world most Nigerians could never touch. His father, Salui Odumegu Ojukwu, was the richest black man in Nigeria, a self-made transport magnate whose empire stretched across West Africa. Trucks, buses, trading companies. By the 1960s, his wealth was estimated at over £4 million, a fortune. Young Emeka, as family called him, grew up in mansions, private tutors, drivers, the finest schools. He could have lived his entire life wrapped in privilege, managing his father's empire, never risking a thing. But his father made a different choice. If you are going to lead, you need the best education the world can offer. At age 13, Ojukwu was sent to England, Epsom College, then King's College Lagos, and finally, in 1952, Oxford University. Lincoln College, Oxford. He studied modern history. He read Plato and Shakespeare, debated in formal halls, wore the black robes of academic privilege. But he also read about revolutions, about colonies that shattered their chains, about men who chose nations over comfort. In 1955, armed with a master's degree, Ojukwu returned to Nigeria, not to his father's business empire, to the Nigerian army. His father was furious. Why would the son of the richest man in Nigeria become a common soldier? Ojukwu's answer was simple: because Nigeria will need soldiers who can think. He had no idea how prophetic those words would become. Ojukwu rose fast through the ranks, too fast for some. An Igbo man with an Oxford education and a famous name, this made him both valuable and threatening in a military where tribal lines were already hardening. By 1963, he was a lieutenant colonel, young, brilliant, ambitious. Then came 1966, the year Nigeria broke. January 15th, 1966, a military coup led mostly by Igbo officers overthrew the government. The prime minister was killed. Northern leaders were assassinated. The coup failed, but the damage was done. 6 months later, northern officers struck back, a counter-coup. Igbo officers were hunted down and executed. The new military leader, General Yakubu Gowon, took power. Ojukwu, now military governor of the eastern region, watched the tension build. Then came September. Across northern Nigeria, Igbo people were targeted, massacred in their homes, on trains, in markets. Hunters became hunted, neighbors became executioners. 30,000 dead in weeks. Some estimates say 50,000. The trains that brought refugees back to the east were mobile nightmares. Women who had watched their husbands butchered, children who no longer spoke, bodies that had survived but eyes that had died. Ojukwu stood on train platforms in Enungu and watched his people return as ghosts. The question facing the eastern region became brutally simple. Can we stay in a federation that wants us dead? Ojukwu's answer would change everything. May 30th, 1967, Enungu, eastern Nigeria. At 8 a.m., Ojukwu's voice crackled across radios throughout the east. Fellow countrymen and women, you, the people of eastern Nigeria, conscious of the supreme authority of Almighty God over all mankind, having mandated me to proclaim on your behalf and in your name that Eastern Nigeria be a sovereign independent republic. The Republic of Biafra was born. 14 million people, a new flag, red, black, and green with a rising sun, a new currency, a new national anthem, a new nation carved from the side of Nigeria. The millionaire son, who could have fled to London, who could have watched from safety, chose to stay. Nigeria's response was immediate. This is armed rebellion. This is treason. July 6, 1967, federal troops crossed into Biafra. The world called it an internal affair. Britain supplied arms to Nigeria. The Soviet Union sent MiG fighters and advisors. The United States called it a regrettable and did nothing. For Ojukwu and 14 million Igbo, Ijara, and other Eastern peoples, it wasn't politics, it was survival. They said Biafra couldn't last a week. It lasted 3 years. Not because it was stronger, but because it refused to think. When the federal forces expected a conventional war, Ojukwu gave them something else. He evacuated entire cities ahead of invasion, denying the enemy their prize. When Nigerian troops marched into Enungu in October 1967, they found empty streets and locked doors. The government had already moved to Umuahia. But Ojukwu wasn't just defending, he was striking. In August 1967, Biafran forces crossed the Niger River and swept into the Midwest. They took Benin City. They reached Ore, just 130 miles from Lagos. For a moment, the impossible became real. The federal government panicked. Victory seemed within reach. Ojukwu didn't order the final push. He chose to consolidate, to protect the East. It's a decision historians still debate. Within weeks, the federal counter-offensive came. Biafran forces were pushed back across the Niger. The war settled into a siege, and Biafra did something remarkable. It became a factory of invention.
The Biafran Research and Production Group, made up of university professors, engineers, students, turned scrap metal into survival. They invented the Ogbunigwe. The name means something that terrifies. Crude rockets made from steel pipes, packed with explosives and shrapnel. Delivery systems welded from car parts. They didn't match federal artillery shell for shell, but they made the cost of invasion terrifyingly high. When fuel ran out, they refined crude oil using local materials. When vehicles broke down, they fabricated spare parts in bush workshops. When the Nigerian Air Force controlled the skies, Biafra made the night its own. Uli. By day, it was just a stretch of the Uli-Yala Road. Women dried cassava on it. Goats wandered across it. But by night, it became an airport. Every evening, villagers filled bomb craters with stones and tar. Kerosene lamps were positioned at precise intervals along the roadside. When the sun set, the highway transformed into a runway. Aircraft came from Sao Tome, Gabon, and Equatorial Guinea. Swedish Count Carl Gustav von Rosen flew tiny MFI-9 trainers at treetop level, too low for radar. Irish priests piloted cargo planes in the Biafran approach, a stomach-churning corkscrew descent through darkness to avoid anti-aircraft fire. They brought powdered milk, stockfish, medicine. Not enough, never enough, but each landing was a message. You are not forgotten. Pilots died. David Brown's last words into the radio were calm. Tell my family, I found my peace. His plane hit the ground in flames. The next morning, women swept the runway. By nightfall, another plane landed where his had burned. Uli kept breathing. For 3 years, it was Biafra's long. But innovation couldn't stop hunger. Nigeria's strategy was deliberate. Blockade, no food in, no supplies in. Starved the rebellion into submission. In London, British officials called it legitimate strategy. In Moscow, the Soviets provided the weapons to enforce it. In Washington, the US declared it complex and looked away. The word kwashiorkor, the Igbo term for severe malnutrition, entered English newspapers. Biafran children appeared on television screens around the world, bellies swollen from starvation, arms like sticks, eyes too large for their skulls. Ojukwu knew the choice that haunts history. He allowed the cameras in. He knew that images of dying children might save other children somewhere else. He knew it would be used as propaganda against Biafra. He chose the gamble. He gave interviews that were almost unbearable to watch. "We are not asking for armies. We are not asking for weapons. We are asking for conscience. We are asking for food." He ate what his soldiers ate, starved when the civilians starved. This wasn't strategy. It was solidarity. A nation watches what its leader puts in his mouth when it is counting grains. At night, he wrote letters to presidents who filed them away, to journalists who sometimes listened, to his children who were too young to read them. "Be proud of your name. Your father belongs to an idea older than himself." By 1969, the maps told the story. The briefings couldn't hide. Biafra was shrinking. Blue pins scattered. Red pins closed in. January 11th, 1970. Uli Airstrip. The federal news had tightened to a chokehold. Owerri had fallen. Uli itself was under artillery range. The last cabinet met in a schoolroom where children's drawings still decorated the walls. Ojukwu asked the question no one wanted to answer. What does honor look like when the war is lost? Some said, fight to the last man. Some said, surrender with dignity. An elder said quietly, when the shrine is burning, the priest does not lie down in it. He saves the sacred flame and runs. The decision was made. Ojukwu would leave, not to save himself, but to prevent his capture from becoming a parade for Lagos. The Super Constellation's engines roared to life. People pressed against the ropes. Babies were lifted into strangers' arms. Hands reached for the wheels, as if they could hold the plane to the earth. A woman who had already buried 3 sons pushed through the crowd. She spat at his feet. Liar, you said we would win. Ojukwu didn't wipe it away. He looked at her with eyes that had aged a decade in 3 years. Your sons kept my promise. They did not kneel. He stepped inside. The door sealed. The aircraft shuddered down the cratered road and climbed into the black. Beneath him, the lamps of Uli, that impossible runway, flickered one last time. January 12, 1970. The Biafran army surrendered. 3 years, 1 million dead. A nation erased from the map. Ojukwu landed in Abidjan, Ivory Coast. Exile. For 12 years, Ojukwu lived in Ivory Coast. He could have disappeared into wealth and comfort. His family's fortune was waiting. Europe would have welcomed him. He stayed politically active. He wrote, he spoke. He refused to apologize for Biafra. Then, in 1982, something unexpected happened. The Nigerian military government, now under President Shehu Shagari, issued a pardon. Ojukwu was free to return. May 1982, Lagos, Nigeria. When his plane touched down, thousands were waiting. In the east, the crowds were overwhelming. They lined the roads for miles, singing, dancing, weeping. The man who had been called a traitor, a warlord, a rebel, was welcomed home as a hero. He didn't return to lead another rebellion. He became a businessman, a politician, an elder statesman. He joined the National Party of Nigeria. He ran for president in 2003 and lost. But he never stopped being Ojukwu. In interviews, when asked about Biafra, he never wavered. We were right to resist. Given the same circumstances, we will do it again. November 26, 2011, London. Chukwuemeka Ojukwu died after a long illness. He was 78. His body was returned to Nigeria. The funeral in Nwenwi was one of the largest in Nigerian history.
Millions lined the streets, not just Igbo people, but Nigerians from every corner of the country. Federal government officials stood beside Biafran veterans. Former enemies saluted the same coffin. Because in the end, even those who opposed him understood. Ojukwu had taught an entire generation that some things are worth more than survival. Dignity, self-determination, the refusal to kneel. That night at Uli in 1970 was not just the end of a war. It was the moment a man became a memory, and a memory became something that refuses to die. Biafra exists on no map today. You won't find it in the United Nations. You can't visit it on vacation. But it lives. In every Igbo child taught to stand up when pushed down. In every story passed from grandmother to grandchild about the war they survived. In the defiant pride of a people who declared for 3 years that they were more than the boundaries drawn by empires. And somewhere in those memories, a woman who lost everything still makes a choice to feed someone else's child before feeding herself. In that decision, in that impossible kindness, a nation that officially no longer exists refuses to die. This is the story of Chukwuemeka Ojukwu, the lion who would not kneel.